Hello and welcome once again to our kitchen table. I am very excited for today's episode because it's our celebration of Pride Month.
Yay! Price right now is opening up a beautiful rainbow fan. It says good vibes on it. It's very sparkly, very gay.
Very gay.
Very gay.
Yeah, and you could see it if you were watching on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel.
Worth it. Worth it to check it out for sure.
Yeah, just watch this clip with the fan and then you basically can just listen to the rest
It's going to
of
be the very beginning of the video.
I am sitting here with my wife, your therapist, and we are going to be talking about this amazing phenomenon, is a word we've used to describe it, this overlap between the neurodivergent community and the LGBTQ plus community.
Yep.
So I'm excited to jump right into this.
Me too.
As always, my name is Price, and I married your therapist.
I'm Ash, and I'm your therapist. Please keep in mind that even though this is a podcast about mental health and therapy, it's not the same thing as or a replacement for therapy.
First things first, from the bottom of our hearts, from our kitchen table to yours, happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride! I love this time of year. It makes me so happy. And I'm so happy that today we're talking about my two favorite communities.
If you are part of the LGBTQ plus community, I hope that this month is a really wonderful celebration of the things that make you you, the hardships that you've had to endure, and that you know that we're supporting you.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's jump right into this.
All right.
The research has shown, because a lot of studies have been conducted, that there is an enormous overlap between LGBTQ plus people and neurodivergent people. If we're looking at a Venn diagram, it's basically just a circle.
I have jokingly said that before, yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of overlap between these communities.
So what has the research shown us about them?
So a couple different things. I know that autistic people are like 70 to 80% self-identify as part of the queer community. That's either having gender differences, being trans, gender non-conforming, gender fluid, something like that, or being gay, bisexual, asexual,
Right.
Those sorts of things. There's a huge overlap. So about 70 to 80% of autistic folks identify that way. A huge portion of ADHD folks, OCD folks, dyslexic folks all fall under this category. And there's been different studies to back all of that up. I think if you're autistic specifically, you're 2 to 3 times more likely to identify as trans. But then back and forth, there's a lot of overlap. I think I see, between being between like 2 to 8 times more likely to, if you're neurodivergent, be queer, or if you're queer, identify as neurodivergent.
Yeah, there was a study from this small backwoods school in 2021 from Cambridge University.
Yeah.
It said
Little known school.
It said the study found that autistic adults and adolescents are approximately 8 times more likely to identify with an other sexuality, that's in quotes, than their non-autistic peers.
Yep.
So if you're autistic, or really, and like you said, we've seen this across neurodivergences.
Yeah.
You're much more likely to identify as not straight, basically.
Yep.
That is so...
Not straight or not cis.
Not straight, not cis. So it has to do with sexuality and gender identity. And that's pretty universally across the board. And we can take a look at the research and kind of know or see that the research indicates that that's true.
Yeah.
But we also, as members of these communities, kind of just know that that's true.
Yeah.
This is kind of a known thing, right?
There is a lot of just like acknowledged overlap between these communities. For instance, I think we're going to get to resources later on, but in some of my like LGBTQ plus affirming groups, people will ask questions about coping with, executive dysfunction or something, because they know that that's a space where people know about these other things.
Yeah.
And yeah, somebody asked about being neurodivergent and the comments are there. People understand what they're talking about and are relating to that and providing assistance. It's really common.
We see it in the comments on our social media. We had a comment recently, like, I love the overlap between autism and LGBTQ plus. and we went to a drag show recently in our little small town in central North Carolina. And one of the performers like brazenly announced that they're autistic as well as gay, which was very funny. And then the crowd went wild, indicating what we already knew, which was that the crowd was generally pretty autistic and gay.
Yeah, they really related to those things. That was their community.
It's so interesting to me that there's this wide overlap. And what other ways do we think that I'm trying to think, what other ways do these communities kind of acknowledge one another as being one and the same?
You mean outside things they have in common? I'm not sure what you're asking.
I guess what I'm getting at is I just want to restate, like, the research indicates that this relationship exists, but we just kind of know it anecdotally as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that, I guess we're going to get into the why in a second, but I think that there's a lot of acknowledged overlap. And if you go to like a neurodivergent affirming like support group, there are going to be a lot of queer folks there. In fact, I started working with the neurodivergent community because I was working with LGBTQ plus folks. And the more that I was making that known at the university I was working at, the more I ended up working with folks who were ADHD, autistic, OCD, dyslexic, all of those things, because there was a big overlap.
So walk us through, because I do want to talk about why.
Okay.
But your story of how you kind of came to acknowledge the fact that you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as the neurodivergent community, perfectly underscores like the relationship between the two.
Yeah. I think this is something that a lot of people will relate to, but and I think that it has to do with masking and with the overlap in these communities in general. But I think that me starting to openly acknowledge and inwardly acknowledge that I'm bisexual was my entry point into also realizing that I'm autistic. So for me, I think that I grew up thinking that everybody was bisexual. We just didn't talk about it. Of course, everybody's attracted to everybody.
Right.
When we talk about being gay being a choice, that's just because some people make the choice to embrace that side of themselves. Like everybody's
inherently attracted to everybody.
Yeah.
That was your lived experience. You just believed that was true.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was just one of those things we didn't talk about, but there were a lot of parts of my experience that we just didn't talk about and didn't acknowledge.
Yeah.
So I thought everybody was having the same sensory issues I was, and that everybody felt like they were putting on a mask in social settings, and we're all, pretending to enjoy things that we really don't because they're very uncomfortable. And so
while you were suffering in silence, you thought everybody was suffering in silence.
Yeah, I was like, this is part of the human experience. We're all like, we're talking about it on the internet and we're not talking about it in person, and that's just what's happening.
Yeah.
And so as I started to recognize that part of myself, which again I knew was always there to some degree, but as I started to come out as bi and really like get more engaged with that community and be in more online spaces, I think I also started to question what other things in my life I had just had to mask, to like tuck away, that weren't the things that you were supposed to be talking about. And definitely that was when I started to notice all of my autistic traits. It was like, oh wait, nobody else was talking about it because other people weren't experiencing that.
And that's kind of what I want to get at, is that we have these pressures on us that we are burdened with. These cultural and societal expectations to behave a certain way, to relate to other human beings a certain way, to learn a certain way. And that kind of gets into neurodiversity. Like, we're people who are neurodiverse are called diverse because we're divergent from the norm, right? And so there is a normal expectation of how human brains work.
Yeah.
And then there's a normal expectation as to like how human sexuality and gender expression work. Like, you're born with this set of genitalia, so that means that you should, be this gender, and that comes with these expectations of how you act,
you'll like, and how you'll relate.
How much of our story has been written for us by
absolutely.
society, like this plural group of like just just culture, right? Not even an individual, just all of these different pressures put on us to behave a certain way.
Oh, yeah.
And then somebody who is queer and neurodivergent is like, yeah, none of this works. None of this is me.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. No, it was getting to question that part of myself was exactly what let me get to question, like, okay, what else have I just been handed that I felt like I had to accept? What else
Sure.
has society or my family and the groups that I was in told me that, like, okay, these things are just going to be true for you? And as I started to really dive into this one area, everything else became more evident. I wonder how many of us are living the lives we were told we were going to live.
We were supposed to live, yeah. But all of a sudden, you started questioning the norms that you felt like you had to conform to, and then what you were on the other side of that was, part of the queer community and neurodivergent.
Yeah.
And it took kind of confronting those things, and that happened during COVID.
Yeah, I think COVID was,
during COVID. COVID's still happening. Like during 2020 quarantine.
Right.
Yeah.
That was really when I was diving into the neurodivergent stuff. And also when I was starting to, I think, more openly embrace, I was like coming out to family and that sort of thing about being bisexual.
Well, I think that was true for a lot of people. We got enough of a break from the daily pressures of our lives, and really were given time to reflect on who we are. I think that a lot of people
Oh, yeah.
came to this,
Yes.
to similar realizations about themselves.
I've talked with a lot of other neurodivergent practitioners who that really became a part of their story because of COVID. I got home and felt like I took, after a couple months at home, I felt like I took my first big breath. I was like, oh, I don't think I've been okay. And I think that's been true for a long time. And that was part of discovering what wasn't okay, what wasn't working for me. And it was the things that I was just supposed to expect, going to an office every day and working there all day and, wearing business clothes and doing all the things that just like were such a strain on my brain just to try to fit in and mask.
You mentioned earlier that when you were working at the university as a counselor on the staff counselor there, you started which came first, neurodiversity or LGBTQ?
I started working with the LGBTQ plus community. I'd put that on my little university bio page, and I had a flag up in my office, and I was kind of becoming open as being the staff member who was part of this community. So people were getting referred to me, and just seeing that bio online.
And then inadvertently, that meant that you were starting to specialize in the neurodivergence.
Yeah, and I had no idea. I had no idea about this overlap. I had no idea that was going to be true, but suddenly I was seeing a lot of clients who were autistic and or ADHD specifically.
Talk to me about the similarities between those two identities. I guess I'm really asking, why is it that there's so much overlap between these two groups?
I think that they're the people who've been willing to question themselves. That if you are queer in some way, for me, that, like I said, that was my start into getting to realize this about myself, is that I was like, okay, so I don't fit into what society's told me in this way. Well, what else isn't fitting in? Oh my gosh, all of these traits that make up autism. But for a lot of folks, I think, who are neurodivergent and maybe know that about themselves first, they're also the ones going, rules are arbitrary.
Yeah.
Like, you're saying that these things work for everybody, but they do not work for me. That this style of learning, this style of relating to folks, this style of like a conversation happens this, and this way, those things just don't fit my brain.
Yeah.
And when you start that process of like questioning and being able to examine yourself, I think you're so much more likely to recognize it's not that being neurodivergent makes you queer or vice versa. It's that you're the person who's more likely to witness both of those things in yourself because you're looking. Yeah. You're willing to question what doesn't fit in.
I think that as somebody with ADHD, the way I approach a work day is so vastly different than the way that maybe some of my colleagues in similar roles approach their work days.
Yeah.
And when I've worked in jobs where my tasks were laid out a certain way, I always bucked that because it didn't conform to what I want.
Yeah.
I think about somebody with autism who, like, if they are expected to make eye contact, that throws them off completely. They lose their train of thought. I'm not able to focus on this conversation if you're making me make eye contact with you. And just things like that. It's like, well, then I inherently don't trust the rules anymore. Like,
yeah, I inherently don't trust the things that you've told me will help me to be successful are actually the things that are true and good for me.
Yeah.
And that you also said that, like, I was born with this set of genitalia, so I'm this sort of person. That's arbitrary.
Yeah.
Somebody made that up. In fact, that's a pretty new concept that, like, gender is just meant to be expressed in these binary boxes, or that sexuality is meant to be expressed in these binary boxes. It wasn't so long ago that being heterosexual was a slur. Like, it was shown to be like a weird, abnormal thing.
Oh, being straight. What was the abnormality?
Yeah, that was, like, at the time, a diagnosable condition to have a weird, like, just attraction to the opposite, in quotation marks, like, gender.
Yeah. Because if you're looking at this from the perspective of, like, sexuality or gender expression is truly a spectrum, then it's very strange. It's a very strange conclusion to come to that the vast majority of the population is explicitly, like, binary in their gender expression or the way that they like express themselves sexually, right?
Yeah, that the reality is that all of these things are occurring on a spectrum, that gender expression and the way that you feel in touch with your gender or the way that you're identifying, all of that is just on a spectrum, and that sexuality, whether you are asexual or have mono attraction to just one gender or have bi plus attraction to more than one gender, all of that just exists on a spectrum. And so we've just, like, boxed off two little tiny pieces of this whole beautiful picture of how humans connect to one another and how they connect to themselves.
And that resonates. This is such, like, a self-report, but that resonates with me a bit because I actually have had the time and bandwidth and space to think about my own sexuality and gender expression. I really do feel very comfortable as a guy. Like, it's a straight white guy. Why would you buck that? Like, that's working for me just fine.
You went and did life on easy mode.
I did. I chose easy mode. And then I also think that I'm straight. But the more that I learn about this stuff and the more that I'm exposed to, like, other ways of living life, I do think that it is kind of odd that I'm only I'm generally only attracted to, like, one gender. But I mean, we were talking about this the other day. I don't really feel inclined to, like, have to think about that too in depth because I'm in a committed relationship with you.
Yeah, monogamous relationship. And,
and I think that, you're hot and it's all working just fine. But I have had the opportunity to kind of reflect on those things. And it is odd that I subscribe to it's very convenient that I subscribe to the cultural kind of norm for identity and expression. But a lot of people don't. I think that maybe most people don't. So a question that was posed recently in my gym, the little hometown gym that I work out at, they were these two older guys who were talking way louder than they should about some shit they shouldn't really be talking about. Were loudly exclaiming, like, why are there so many more fucking gay people now? Like, every time I turn around, there's more gay people. Like, they were talking about it like it was COVID, which was funny because they didn't even talk about COVID like it was COVID. They didn't even believe in COVID, even though a lot of people in that gym got COVID and died. There's a whole I'm sorry. I'm going to back this up a little. I'm going to take a step back. Okay. They were talking about it like it's a disease on society, and they were remembering the good old days when there weren't any gay people. And what they meant were there weren't any gay people on TV. Right. They were hearkening back to or
any gay people who felt safe
to
openly presenting that way and claiming that for themselves.
So I actually, like, said some words to them, and it wasn't very pleasant, and I was not very nice. But I was standing up for my gay brothers and sisters and non-binary pals. And but the purpose of, like, that interaction where I was kind of saying, like, you're creating an environment that's, like, less safe for people that I care about when you're talking about this. They are raising a good point, though,
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting that there are more gay people today. Or at least there's more gay people who are out now, right?
Yeah, that's the difference.
What's your take on this?
That people have, well, one, that there's more safety. Now, that's not always true, and there are a lot of things trying to go against that. But in general, there's more safety, and there's also more representation. That, like, I have always been attracted to women, but I didn't realize that.
Men and women, right?
Right, to men and, right, right.
All right, that was a close one.
I'm across the spectrum. I'm very, like, pan, but bi plus. But, yeah, so I didn't realize that other people were feeling this way. I didn't know that it existed.
Yeah.
I knew that it was true in me, but I didn't realize that that was a possibility for anybody's life because there had been so little representation of that.
Yeah.
That said, representation was just helping me to see something that was already true about me. There has been a lot of research to demonstrate that, like, representation is not what makes people queer. That, you know, most gay folks now grew up with just straight couples on TV and just straight representation in all other forms of media.
Yeah.
And that's what was acceptable. And they were still gay. Like, that's not what's making that happen.
Or even your story. You lived the life you were allowed to live. You weren't allowed to be anything but straight.
Yeah.
You know? So you just thought everybody feels bi, but
yeah, we
but
all
you
just
didn't even
do
have that
what we're
language
supposed
for
to
it.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you just fell into line. Here's an interesting study. The percentage of the population by generation that is out, that has claimed that they are anything other than straight. Baby boomers, 3%. Millennials, 3%.
Wait, not millennials.
Sorry. Gen X, 3%. Millennials, we jumped to 11%.
Yeah.
And then Gen Z coming in at 20%.
Yeah.
The question is Gen Z inherently gayer than the baby boomers and, you know, Gen X are? Are they gayer than the millennials? Or perhaps are they more able to identify as what they truly are?
There's the same thing that's happening within, like, why so many neurodivergent folks are also queer in some way.
That's so true.
Is that they've gotten to take the time to ask those questions of themselves. And I think there's something really freeing about being neurodivergent and being like, oh, I already don't fit into this box. Well, where else don't I fit in? What else is just true about me that nobody told me about, that nobody acknowledged might happen for me? And I think that Gen Z is getting to come into this world, like, being able to ask those questions.
Yeah.
That other people around them are asking those questions. Not only is there more safety, but they're just seeing it and they're like, oh, well, I have a best friend who is trans. I wonder how I feel about my gender. And maybe they arrive at cis. Yeah. But just having asked the question.
Well, what's a shame for those guys at the gym who were talking like, where are all these gay people coming from? They were probably born and raised in an environment where it was fucking dangerous to be anything but straight.
Yep.
In fact, I know that if they're from this area, I know it was dangerous for them. That they probably knew of people who died over that, and they didn't have exposure to anything else. Yeah, they didn't have any exposure or any representation of anything else. So who knows what those guys are? Yeah, they may not.
No, I think that every time at your gym that, like, they are certainly representing other parts of this community. There are certainly folks at your gym who would have been queer in a different life. Had they gotten to openly acknowledge those parts of themselves. But I know that that's true because if I were to say that out loud at the gym, I would receive a lot of anger and hatred because it's not a question they're allowed to ask themselves. That if they had all considered it and all really knew that they were straight and cis, why would that question bother you? Yeah. But when you're in a space where you're not even allowed to think that difference might exist, there's a lot of anger that comes up. And so in all of these spaces where we see so many pockets of anger coming up in response to people who identify with a different sexuality or a different gender or just some diversity there, if there's anger coming up, that means you're not allowed to ask the question. Like, of course, there's less diversity represented in those groups.
Yeah, if you ask somebody if they're gay and the response is, I'm not fucking gay, fuck you. They may be gay or straight.
Right, they might also be straight.
Yeah, it just means that they're not even allowed to ask that question.
Yeah, exactly.
That's such a good point. And what's funny is that when you live in a neurodivergent brain, generally you're so just aware of like factual truths, like objective truths, that question not only doesn't bother you, it's a question you've asked yourself because you've had to question everything.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, like, as an autistic person, I am very curious about the way that my brain works. I've always been very like, why do I think this thing? Where does that come from? And like examining parts of myself. Of course, I was more likely to go, oh, this thing exists.
Yeah.
Like, what could that be true for me?
I'm cooking up a little slogan for this podcast, and
Yeah?
I've said it on a couple episodes. Embrace your brain. And that includes gender identity and sexuality. You know, it's just embrace who you are.
Yeah.
Because you are what you are. Period.
Yep. Yeah, those parts of you already exist. Like those parts are already there, that already exists, and not getting to embrace that really, we do a lot of harm to ourselves and to our communities. Like the people who are open about their representation make the world a better, safer place for everybody to live in.
Yeah.
For everybody who has any difference. And both of these communities openly embracing the differences in their brain or in their sexuality and gender are making the world a better, safer place for everybody.
Yeah. And I don't know why this is where my brain's going right now, but like even if the whole world were just like, let's say Christian, because that's been my experience. I was raised in the Christian church. And you would think, okay, we're unified now. Y'all don't even have any idea how like fragmented the Christian church is.
Oh, right.
Or even the denominations within the Christian.
Yep. And then those individual churches and then the people within them.
When we respect the right to live a different type of life, that's best for everyone because there's always division. Even when we start getting more and more homogenous with our belief systems or the color of our skin or whatever it may be, like there's always fragmentation.
Yeah, life requires like differences in diversity.
Yeah.
That things die out when there's not enough diversity within a species or within whatever. Like you need that to be able to adapt and live in your environment. And it's what makes the world so beautiful. And the world is much more beautiful for having queer and neurodivergent folks in it.
There's one other thing I wanted to say before we move on. It's that I think that Gen Z specifically is so much more able to be out.
Yeah.
And we've heard a lot of anecdotal like responses to everybody thinks they're autistic because of TikTok. You know, these social networking apps, which I have plenty of criticism for, that's totally valid. But one thing that they're doing that's amazing is they're connecting people to community.
Yeah.
And I think about people like these guys at the gym or even my grandfather who like would have been murdered if they had come out because there was no community with which
there was
they would
no
have fit
space to observe that in themselves or to encounter other people asking the same questions and doing the same thing.
And I cannot reflect on that without just acknowledging the deepest respect and disbelief with the courage that people throughout history have had to unapologetically be themselves in the face of great adversity.
Yeah, absolutely. That like 3% represented in those other generations, like what an incredible group of people that were actually part of a much bigger part of the population, but they were the ones like openly claiming it at great personal cost a lot of the times.
This Pride Month, that's what I'm going to be reflecting on, is those people who are unapologetically themselves. I'm going to be asking myself, how can I stand up for myself and for others to be themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question to be asking ourselves. Speaking of history stuff as well, with the neurodivergent community and having this overlap, it's been very recent that we've even understood that autistic people are sexual beings in general.
Yeah, we said that they're not interested.
Yeah, for the longest time, we just said autistic folks, and this is based on those old stereotypes of what autism is.
I'm so glad you're bringing this up,
Yeah, we've said for the longest time that we don't even think that those people have a sexuality, much less could have a difference in sexuality.
Which is furthering that
infantilization.
Yeah, just furthering that view of these folks, you know?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That we've had a very, like, these people are underdeveloped and like children, and that they don't have a sexuality, they're not questioning their gender. And as it turns out, like, not only are those things absolutely true,
y'all be fucking
but yeah, we are much more likely to be a part of these different communities. Not because being neurodivergent makes you that way, but because it lets you ask the question. It makes you brave enough to like question yourself.
No, if you're anywhere close to these two groups, y'all know that sex is happening.
Oh yeah, the like kink community and the BDSM community. So many of those are filled with like neurodivergent folks, queer folks, that there's a lot of sex and sexuality happening within the community, and playing with gender and having understanding of differences, and that's a beautiful thing. Again, they're the folks willing to like ask the question.
And they're usually the folks who are willing to live and let live in a beautiful way, too. I'm just doing what I want to do. You get to just do what you want to do, as opposed to the critics who are all about, I want to stop you from having a good time.
Well,
I want to stop you living the life that brings you fulfillment.
When you've embraced your own differences, when those things are allowed to just exist and be, it's so much easier to embrace differences in somebody else.
Yeah.
When you're not allowed to ask those questions, again, that's where that anger and defensiveness comes from.
I was literally taught that the gay agenda, again, from that Christian perspective, that the gay agenda was to not stop until everybody's gay.
Right.
That's not true. But usually when somebody's making an accusation, they're saying something about themselves.
Which is really funny when the other agenda is that everybody is straight and cis.
Yeah, the Christian agenda is make sure everybody's straight and cis.
Right.
Painting with broad brushstrokes.
Brushstrokes, yeah.
Something I asked you to take a look at and come prepared with for this is to help anybody who is neurodivergent and or LGBTQ plus with resources of online pockets of community where they might find support and friendship even.
Yep. And I wrote them down, and now you are going to read them out because you have the screen.
Thanks for writing them down.
You're so welcome.
I'm giving you full credit. The first one, I know you want to say a few words on. You might want to learn about trans people. Yes,
this is one that we've mentioned before, but Lady Evie Winters runs this page. She's a trans woman. She has a great team of mods. It's specifically a space to be talking about exploring gender.
Yeah.
But it's a very neurodivergent place. And so there's a lot of conversation about neurodiversity. She's exploring being like ADHD and talking about that a lot. So that's a really wonderful place to get in community with other people. Plus, they have a Discord channel.
Yep.
Very Discord server.
Discord channel. Mm-hmm. Server,
and some channels that I believe are just for neurodivergent folks. So that's a really good place to get connected. The rest of these are about to be Facebook groups. I think I have like 2 favorites from this list or something, but I'm just worried that like Facebook groups come and go. So maybe by the time you're checking this out, they're no longer active. But right now, they've been good spaces for learning. And
I hate to sound like a Gen X or, dear God, a baby boomer recommending Facebook groups, but Facebook is a good place for these sorts of communities.
Yeah, that's something, unfortunately, Evie Winters has talked a lot about, that like Facebook isn't ideal, but man, it's a really easy way to find these communities. So that's where these are.
I'll just read these off. Get your pen and paper ready. This is autistic culture.
Mm-hmm. That's where people are asking, is this autistic culture? Is this something that other autistic folks relate to? So it's a fun one.
Neurodivergent adulting.
I really recommend that, especially for questions about dealing with executive dysfunction.
Asking autistics. Mm-hmm. Neurodivergent women.
I really love that one. There's a lot of activity on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Neurodivergent learning and life skills.
That's another good one for talking about different coping skills and strategies.
Neurodivergent, but make it queer.
Love that one.
And then the next one's the website, indietherapist.com.
Indie, the letter N, the letter D for neurodivergent therapist.com. It is a website. It's a therapist directory, and it's therapists who are just neurodivergent. Not that they work with those communities. They are themselves neurodivergent, and they work with those communities. It's a really great place to get connected with a therapist who really understands you.
Also, if you're not actively like seeking therapy or in a position where you can pursue that, it is not a mistake to reach out to these therapists and ask for resources or support groups. They're connected, or they should be connected.
Oh, sure.
So if you find somebody in your area, like, don't hesitate to email. I know Ash,
That's a good point.
You'll help somebody out if they're like, hey, I can't afford sessions right now, but how could I be connected? You would definitely point somebody in the right direction.
Yep, that's a really good point. Those are going to be good local resources for you to connect with and see if they have local recommendations for you. And then the last thing, if you really don't have access to a neurodivergent therapist, if you really can't find somebody who's doing that sort of affirming support in your area, something that I've been recommending to folks is find a very openly queer therapist. Because one, they're so much more likely to be part of the neurodivergent community, but they're just going to be somebody who's ready to embrace more differences. And so while I think the ideal situation is getting to find somebody who's both openly neurodivergent and queer, it's a lot easier to find like an openly gay therapist than an openly autistic one at the moment. So that might be a good starting place if that's all you have.
Well, you're openly both.
Yeah.
Where can we find you?
You can find me at therapy_Ash on Instagram. You can find us at I Married Your Therapist on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Email us at imarriedyourtherapist@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Remember, listeners, want to encourage you, whether you're neurodivergent or not, whether you're LGBTQ plus or not, embrace your brain.
Yeah.
And be willing to explore what makes you you and what is it about society that's contributed to this idea of you.
Yep.
Are you living a version or are you truly being your most authentic self? Because if you're looking for ways to like reduce stress, reduce anxiety, and to live a happier, more fulfilled life, that starts with embracing who you are.
Yeah. What part of your narrative did other people write for you to whatever degree? And what would you like it to be instead?
Happy Pride Month, all y'all.
Happy Pride!
As always, Ashlyn, thank you so much for your time today.
Price, thank you for your time.
And we will see you next time on I Married Your Therapist. Pride Month, Pride Month, Pride Month.
It's my favorite time of year. I'm so excited. My birthday's in June, but I've never had a favorite time of year until like this point in my life. And man, I love Pride.
It's like the holiday season for you.
Yeah. I hate how like corporations do the rainbow thing, rainbow washing.
It's so performative.
It's so performative. But man, I just love seeing everything gay this time of year. Like, bring it on. I don't want to buy from you, but let's make everything rainbow.
I'll shell out for gay Oreos. I mean rainbow Oreos.